If you were here last Sunday, we're in our Promise series, and we got to look at this amazing faith of Abraham as he entrusted his only son, his promised son, Isaac, into God's hands, into a situation that didn't make a lot of sense. And what happens after that is Isaac grows up and he continues his family line. He has two sons of his own, Jacob and Esau, some pretty unique guys. And then Jacob, despite his own failures, God blesses Jacob and gives him 12 sons. And so God is building this family that's going to become this nation. And I don't know if you're familiar, one of my favorite stories in all of Genesis is about Jacob's son, Joseph, and the journey that God takes him on. Well, this morning is going to be pretty special because it's not going to be a normal Sunday. Typically, Drew or I or somebody would come up here and open our Bibles and just walk us through the text. But today, we're in for a treat. We actually get a firsthand account of what happened in the Genesis story. So would you welcome with me coming to the stage the one and only Jacob's son, Joseph?
I'm used to having a lot of power, but I don't know if I've ever really gotten a chance to tell my story. I'm used to having people listen to me, but I really want to share with you guys my heart. Most of the time when people hear my name, they think of my coat, and this is a pretty sweet coat. And the coat just tells part of my story, but my story's a lot bigger than my coat. In fact, this dang thing got me in so much trouble. Over and over and over again, it was like coats were always getting me in trouble. You see, my story started, and Kyle kind of helped us understand this, my story started the son of Jacob. And I was loved by Jacob. Can I just tell you guys honestly, I was amazing. I was Jacob's favorite child. He gave me this coat to tell everybody that I was his favorite. So that every time I walked around, all my older brothers, Rachel was my mom, and all my stepbrothers, I was the oldest of Rachel and Jacob, all my stepbrothers hated me because I was loved, and every time they saw me, I wore my sweet digs. They hated me so much, and I didn't actually help the problem. There were often times I'd tell them about dreams that I was having. There was this one dream that I had with 10 stars and a sun and a moon, and all of the things were bowing to my star. And I told my brothers, that's you. There were 12 heads of wheat, and all of the wheat was bowing to my wheat. So my brothers, they didn't love Joseph like they should have. They didn't care for me the way that my father cared for me. They didn't love me. They didn't understand how awesome I was. But I knew. There was a point, though, in our relationship with you guys have sibling fights, right, where you don't always get along? And they didn't like me, and I wasn't helping the scenario, and there was a point where they decided, we're going to kill him. We want to be rid of him. We hate him. So Dad told me one day, hey, go check on your brothers, because I didn't actually do hard work. I heard I'm kind of like your senior pastor. I don't like getting my fingernails dirty. I don't like being out with the people. And so Dad said, hey, go check on your brothers. So I went and I checked on them, and I was a far way off. And as I started to go see my brothers, they recognized me. They saw me a long way away, and they were tired of dealing with me. They were tired of me being the favorite. They were tired of me being loved. So they said, let's be done with this guy. Let's kill him. So they concocted a plan to play. And again, I was obvious. I was a little, you could tell who I was. So I walk up to them, and I get ready to see them and spend some time with them, and they capture me, and they throw me into a dry well. I give Reuben the credit. Reuben was the oldest son. He didn't really want to give an account to Dad that Joseph was dead. So they throw me in this dry well so they can figure out what they're going to do with me, and Reuben said, hey, we really shouldn't kill this guy. We don't want his blood on our hands. So they throw me in this dry well, which I don't even think they knew was dry until they didn't hear the splash. So I'm in this well, and I'm saying, guys, this isn't cool. Hazing is illegal. Reuben goes off to work, and the brothers get together, and it was actually Judah. Judah was the one that said, hey, guys, we got to figure this out now. the Ishmaelites were walking by, and they were on their way to Egypt. Maybe you remember the Ishmaelites from your series, but they were going to Egypt, and they were carrying all these spices. They were traders with a D, and they were carrying spices and herbs and all these things. You guys have things called potpourri nowadays, right? And it reeks. And they're carrying all this because it's a part of their main trade, and they're taking it to Egypt, and Jacob was the one that says, hey guys, I got a solution. We can take Joseph and sell him to the Ishmaelites. So they sold me for 20 pieces of silver. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty special. I thought that was pretty cheap. I expected more from them. So they sell me for 20 pieces, and they throw me in their caravan, and those dang spices, this is why I hate potpourri. Because as we traveled to Egypt, all I thought about was this betrayal. Was this hurt? Was this pain? Was that over and over again I realized that I wasn't as loved as I thought I was loved. So I traveled to Egypt. Now, meanwhile, back at the farm, see, what happened was they go back to Dad. They took my coat. See, I'm pretty well off now. My coat's been restored, as you can tell. But they ripped it. They took animal blood. They killed the goat, and they put it on there, and they gave it to Dad, and they said, Dad, we don't know what happened. You can imagine what happened to my dad, Jacob. I want you to imagine that just for a second, losing the thing that you love the most. Jacob was devastated. Jacob was heartbroken. Jacob said, what happened to my son? I sent him to you. I sent him to help you. I was bringing supplies. Jacob was kind of the ringleader. Reuben was the oldest, but Jacob was the one that talked the most. Judah then said to Jacob, Judah just said, Dad, I'm sorry you feel this way, but I'm really not very sorry. He said, life's going to be better now because we don't have him in the middle of it. Now, we were what you would call a dysfunctional family. Maybe you get that just already. And I'm convinced that Judah and Reuben and all the other brothers thought that if we just got rid of Joseph, then it would be better. But here's the reality, it got worse because Jacob went into deep depression. He's lost something he cares about, and he feels like his life is over, and this thing that's his idol has now been destroyed. And Jacob became someone that was no longer fun to be around. And you know what Judah did? Judah took off. Judah said, I'm out of here. So Judah left, and he goes to the land of Canaan. Now, we knew this from great-grandpa Abraham. We're not supposed to intermarry with other people. God was creating in us, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, he was creating in us a special people that he was going to use to show his love and his glory to the entire world so that people in El Dorado Hills in 2015 would know about it. That's what God was doing. So he gave Grandpa Abraham some specific instructions to not intermarry, to keep us set apart, to be separate for his purposes, for his glory. But Judah didn't really care. Judah was a punk. Judah said, you know what, Dad? You're just too much work. Joseph was too much work. I'm out of here. So Judah takes off to the land of Canaan, and he starts marrying all these little Canaanite women. And he loved them, and all of a sudden it was as if now the people of God, at least the line of Judah, was going to be totally intermarried. In fact, maybe you know the story, but for 400 years my people hung out in Egypt. For 400 years, you know why? You can thank Judah. I think it took us that long because if Judah had his way, he just would have kind of melded right into the Canaanite people. Because here's what the Egyptians felt about us Hebrew people. They didn't like us at all. They didn't want relationship with us at all. It didn't matter how immoral Judah was. They wanted nothing to do with him. In fact, they just didn't like Hebrew men. I don't know why. I think I'm beautiful. And so really, other than Potiphar's wife, they wanted nothing to do with Hebrew men, even when we tried to intermarry. And I think that's really why we had to hang out for 400 years in Egypt. So Judah's going on. You got to remember who Judah is. He's a punk, but he's also the guy that Jesus is going to come from. It's his seed. It's from the house of Perez, who we're going to see all the way in the book of Ruth. And over again, we see God use failures like Judah. But I'm getting distracted. That's not really what I'm here to talk about. I'm on my way to Egypt. When I get to Egypt, I get put on the auctioning block. Now, you can imagine, I'm about 18 years old, 17, 18, 19 at this time. I am a stud. I am good looking. I am well manicured. I am a fine catch. And you guys know, you guys have these things called like flip this house. This was like flip this son. They bought me for 20, and again, they don't even want to write it down because I think it was a record how much I went for. I got sold actually to a guy by the name of Potiphar. Potiphar was an official for Pharaoh. He was like the top official, and he saw me and he said, hey, that guy comes from there, and I've heard stories about God and God's favor in the life of the Hebrews. So he bought me, and I started like a shepherd boy like everybody else. I started taking care of his stuff, and I took care of his house. But what happened was I started to earn my way up the ranks. Over and over and over again, Potiphar would give me something, and I would prove that I could do it better than anybody else. So I started as a shepherd. I worked my way up his household ranks to the point where actually I did everything. Whenever Potiphar said, hey man, Potiphar's amazing, he did such a good job, you know who really did a good job? Joseph. I did it all. All Potiphar had to do was eat and sleep. That's it. I took care of everything for this man. And I had fun doing it. I felt like God had me here for a reason. You see, even though I remember those smells and I remember that journey, I remember being sold into slavery, I still believe that God had something that he was doing. So I'm sitting there in Potiphar's house, and I'm doing my job, and I'm working hard. And did I mention to you guys that I was really good looking? So I've got my life put together. God is blessing everything I do, and people started to notice. So many people started to notice that actually Potiphar's wife noticed. Now, Potiphar's wife, because of the affidavit that we signed, I can't tell you her name. So no one knows her name. It's confidential. But Potiphar's wife saw something in me. She saw a character, an integrity, a fact that I was going to work hard, a fact that I was nobody, but because of my work ethic, I became somebody. And Potiphar's wife continued to woo me. You ever been wooed by a woman? Okay, I didn't think you'd understand. But over and over and over, I'd come in the house, and she would kind of touch my arm. She'd say, "My, what big arms you have." Spend time with me. She asked me to sing to her, to quote her poetry. And for the most part, I kind of kept her away. She was beautiful, but she wasn't mine. She was my master's. Not like a piece of property, but they were married. They were together. It would have been disrespectful to her, but even more so to him, and even more so to my God. So over and over again, Potiphar pursues me. And we've got this phrase that we use with the brothers now: if you can be accused of being guilty, you're already guilty. So I worked really hard to not put myself in situations where she could make a pass and there wasn't someone around me to say, well, this is a little awkward. But there was this one day, I walked in the house, and I should have known better. I saw candles. I smelt that potpourri, and there's nothing good that comes from potpourri. You with me? I smelt these things, and I walk in, and sure enough, I don't hear any voices but Potiphar's wife. She grabs my coat. I don't know what it is about me and coats, but she grabs my coat. She says, come on, no one's here. I made sure of it. I ran. It wasn't worth it. She was attractive. Don't misunderstand me. But she wasn't worth what it would have cost me and my God. So I took off, but she grabbed my coat. She took it off, and I ran, and I remember running away, and I remember that scream. You know those screams? Ah! And it was when that happened that as I'm running, I go, oh, no. I knew it was coming. All the housekeepers came together, and they said, Miss, what's wrong? Miss, what's wrong? And she said, Joseph tried to seduce me. You ever been accused of something you didn't do? I didn't try to seduce her at all. I ran, but of course no one believed me, so she kept on to my coat. Potiphar comes home, and she says, honey, look what Joseph did to me. She showed scratches. She showed the coat. Potiphar sent me to prison. All I had done at this point for Potiphar was make him money and make him more attractive to Pharaoh as the top dog. That's all I had done for Potiphar. Over and over and over again, I had served this man faithfully, but I found myself in prison. It's moments like these that you have a tendency to doubt if God is God. I knew the stories from Grandpa Abe, though. I knew the stories of God's faithfulness. It was in that moment that I remember saying, God, if you are faithful, show me. Reveal to me. So you got to understand, in prison, it's not like your guys' prisons. My prison was underneath the house of Potiphar. See, Potiphar was the top dog official. They had this dungeon, and that's where all the prisoners went. So I sat under. I could hear Potiphar's wife. lying about me, slandering about me, telling me all these things that weren't true about me. And I sat there and I listened. And I said, God, show me that I can trust you. God, I believe the stories of our grandparents. Show me who you are. Show me where you are. And you'll never believe what happens. I'm sitting in prison. I'm just doing my job. And then all of a sudden, the head of the prison comes to me and says, hey, Joseph, I actually believe you. I don't know if I buy this story from Potiphar's wife. She's kind of a whore. And I said, oh, thank you. And he slowly gave me power and authority within the prison. In fact, what happened was he said, you're the man. I'm going to just make you the head of the prison. You know what happens when people who are in authority give you authority? If they're smart, they do no work and they get all the credit. That's like my life. Over and over again, I would do things. So the head of the prison, all of a sudden it became known throughout the whole land of Egypt that the prison of Pharaoh at Potiphar's house was the best run organization in the country. Who got credit for that? The head of the prison. Who got all the work? Me. But I did it. It was very clear it's what God called me to because it's where I was. So I'm sitting in this scenario, and I'm overseeing the prison, and something changed for me. In fact, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but I actually started to serve the people I was over as opposed to intimidate them or mock them or throw it in their face. That's part of what led me to have a high ranking everywhere I went, was I served people. I took care of them. I loved them. I cared about them more than myself. So I'm serving in this prison, and more people come in. And this wasn't like one of those prisons where it's like you wanted to be there because you got 3 square meals a day. Not one of those prisons. This wasn't a prison that many people came out of. I remember one week 2 more officials come in. It was actually the head baker and the head butler for Pharaoh. And they came in and they were distraught. They were downtrodden. They understood that once they got in, they probably weren't getting out. So they're in the prison, and there was one day I walked over, I said, hey, what's going on, man? Why do you look so depressed? He's like, dude, you know that we're in prison, right? Yeah, but God's here. God's presence is here just like it is out there, so I'm just trying to live faithfully in God's presence. So it was the butler that I was talking to first. The butler said, well, I'm having these dreams. I don't know what to do with them. I said, well, what are they? He said, well, I'm having these dreams, and I've got this harvest, and I've got these 3 vines and these grapes, and I take these grapes, and I crush them into a cup, and I give the cup to Pharaoh of these 3 vines. What does that mean? I know you're a God-fearer. I know you're a man of God. And I just told him, I said, I'm pretty sure what it means, God told me, is just simply this. In 3 days, you're going to be released. You're going to be the one that hands Pharaoh his cup like you used to. And when that day happens, will you do me a favor? Will you remember me? Will you remember me? Because I, like you, don't deserve to be here. So when you get out, will you please tell him about me? I said, yeah. Now, the baker heard about my dream telling, and he's like, man, I want some good news too. So he comes over and he says, hey, would you interpret this dream? I said, absolutely. He said, well, I was the head chef and the baker for Pharaoh's house, and I've got this dream of these 3 baskets of pastry, and they're sitting on top of my head, and these birds are kind of pecking at them. What does that mean? I said, well, like you, in 3 days, you're going to be released because you're going to be hung from a stake post, and the birds are going to pick at your flesh until it's dry. And he said, no, really, what does it mean? No, that's it. Sure enough, 3 days later, Pharaoh was getting ready to throw a big birthday party, so he invited a ton of people, and these 2 prisoners get released. The butler takes off, the baker takes off, and the baker is part of the festivities to honor Pharaoh with his death. But the butler's restored. God was doing something and restored the butler, all because I was able to serve and was able to point to them that God was in their life even when they couldn't see it. Dang butler. You know when you do things for people and you just ask something very, very simple in return and they don't? What do you want to do with them? You see, I thought that when I told the butler, hey, you're going to get out, I thought that was my ticket out of this prison. But the butler forgot me. For 2 years, I hang out in that prison. And you know how easy it would have been when you're hanging out in 2 years in a prison? No, you don't. You're from El Dorado Hills. You have no idea what that's like. But for 2 years, I'm in a prison. And there were moments I was tempted to doubt. Moments I was tempted to say, but God, I thought that the butler was the way I was getting out. Didn't happen. 2 years passed, and then there's a verse in my biography from Genesis that says, but the butler. I love that word but. Are we a fan of that word but? I like big butts, and I cannot lie. But I want you to note something. When it says but the butler, it's actually not about the butler, it's about God. God's the one doing something. God's just using the butler. So the verse says, but the butler remembered. Because here's what's going on in Pharaoh's house. The butler's serving Pharaoh and all this kind of stuff, and the butler's good. But he's overhearing all these conversations that the Pharaoh is in distress. Pharaoh's having dreams, and the butler remembers that I'm the dream weaver. That I'm the one that actually knows how to interpret dreams, not because of me, but because of my God. So the butler tells Pharaoh, you need to talk to Joseph. Pharaoh goes, oh, that's right, I remember Joseph. He was that faithful guy that Pharaoh's wife kind of abused and took advantage of, and he was honorable. Bring him to me. Bring him to me. So I show up to Pharaoh's house to interpret his dreams. Now, here was the dreams. Because Egypt was big, but man, word traveled fast. And I could hear everything because I'm just down in the dungeon of Pharaoh's house, of Potiphar's house. And I knew of the dream. The dream was of 7 fat cows that got eaten by 7 skinny cows. And then there were 7 large grains of wheat, heads of wheat, that were eaten by 7 skinny heads of wheat. And I go into Pharaoh's house. Now, here's something I've learned in my life. You guys know common sense isn't very common, right? In my mind, this isn't that complicated. But all the Pharaoh's advisors, all their wisdom, they couldn't figure it out. So I come onto the scene and I say, well, this is very clear. You're going to have 7 years of abundance, and then you're going to have 7 years of famine to follow. Now, I went beyond just the interpretation. I made a proposal. I said, guys, we need to have a plan to figure out what we're going to do during those 7 years of abundance so that we're ready for the 7 years of nothing. Pharaoh's like, oh my gosh, that's the smartest thing I've ever heard in my life. And you have character, and you have integrity, and I like adding the part, and I'm handsome. So Pharaoh says, I need a man like you. Pharaoh does with me what Potiphar did with me, what the jailer did with me, what even my dad, Jacob, had done with me. Pharaoh says, why don't you take care of everything, and I'll get all the credit. So Pharaoh puts me in charge. I come with this plan. Now you gotta understand, I was in prison the week before. I didn't show up with my business cards. I wasn't trying to get out. I was just trying to be faithful. I think that's the call on all of our lives. Be faithful. If you're in prison, be faithful. If you're with Potiphar's wife, be faithful. If you're with Pharaoh, be faithful. That's all I was doing, was being faithful. So I'm faithful to the call on my life, and Pharaoh takes me out of prison. Guys, I got out of prison. It wasn't that fun. But God was with me. And I got out of prison, and for the next years, I am a celebrity. Everybody knows my name. But I realized that it wasn't about them knowing my name, it was about them knowing his name. I set up this country for success. I had a business plan that I modeled and I executed to a T. And the 7 good years, they were good, and we were faithful, and we saved, and we prepared for the 7 years of nothing. And 2 years into those 7 years of nothing, actually, hold on. See, sometimes I get a little confused here. Even before that, man, my life was on a roll. I had kids. I had these 2 sons during this season of my life. Manasseh was one of his names, and Manasseh simply meant this: God has made me forget. See, it was in that moment coming out of prison that God reminded me that he was in control of all the garbage in my life, and he actually allowed me to forget and forgive what my brothers had done to me. Not only did I name my son Manasseh, but then I named my other son Ephraim. The reason I named him Ephraim is because that means fruitful. God had taken me from nothing and had made me fruitful. But this was about God. This wasn't about me. So when I say I was on a roll, please do hear my heart. God was doing something in me and through me. So life continued on. It was about 2 years into the lean years that my brothers showed up to the palace. My brothers. You remember my brothers, right? They didn't like me very much. They abused me. They heckled me. These were my brothers. They show up at my house. Here's why. Because back at the ranch, what was going on is they were running out of food. And they heard, Dad in particular, heard there was food in Egypt. And they said, guys, what are you doing here? See, back in my day when we had kids, it was really for one primary purpose. It was to serve the Father. I think we should start that today. So Dad comes to all of my brothers and says, what are you doing here? They have food in Egypt. Get out of here, you lazy bums, and go get me some food. Take care of my family. So they take off and they go to Egypt. They come in to my palace. where I am well regarded, where I am loved. And they walk in, and I recognize them right away. I knew exactly who they were. They didn't know who I was, but I knew exactly who they were. And they come down, and they bow down before me. Now, I was very uncomfortable when anybody bowed to me. Pharaoh at times would say, you have to stand here and let them bow. I said, no, we only bow to God. I'm not worthy of praise. I'm nothing but a sold slave and a prisoner myself, but God. And they bowed to me, and it was at that moment that I remembered all those dreams from when I was a kid, all the stars, all the heads of wheat. It was like it was being fulfilled in front of me. I was humbled. I didn't do anything that had deserved this, but God was doing something. And all these brothers bow to me, and they come and they say, will you help us? Now, to be honest, I recognized who they were. They didn't know who I was, and I had a bigger plan. I had already forgiven them. This wasn't about vengeance. I was going to cause them some pain. You guys know that pain is good sometimes? I was going to cause them some pain, but it wasn't for the purpose of pain. It was for the purpose of them recognizing God. That's why I did it. So I created a plan on the spot. I think God gave it to me. I actually accused them of being spies. I said, you are saying that you're here for food, but I think that you're a spy. No, I didn't think they were a spy. They were harmless. I said, you're a spy. I throw them into prison for 3 days. I let them come out, and I say, here's what I'm going to do. I actually believe that you're not a spy. The reason I believe them is because they told me about Benjamin. I was just trying to get information from them. They said, we're just 10 brothers. We have one more at home. I said, perfect. If you have one more at home, I'm going to take one of your brothers. I'm going to keep him as a captive for me. And I want you to go home and bring your brother back. Now, in my way, it was a test to them so that they could prove to me that they weren't spies. Really, I just wanted to see my brother that I loved. I wanted to know that he was okay. I wanted to see that he was doing all right. It was at that moment that I remember telling them what was going to happen. And Reuben, the older brother, remember Reuben's the one that says, hey, guys, we shouldn't do this? Reuben's like, our sins have caught up to us. God knows what we've done. We deserve this. So I let him out of prison, but I bind Simeon. I throw him in prison, and I say, I'm going to keep him until you go home and bring me back your brother Benjamin. I loaded up their sacks. I sent them on their way, but I didn't tell them that I told my servant to put the money back in their sacks. So as they get home, they're walking on the journey home, and as they travel, one of the guys goes in to get some grain to feed the donkey, and he realized there's money in his sack, and he's like, oh, crap. Now, can I say crap at church? Don't tell Drew. I think I just ripped my outfit. Good thing I have lots of servants. And this brother goes, oh my gosh. We just stole from the highest official in the world. What are we going to do? And they get home and they tell Dad what happened. They tell Dad, okay, so you'll never believe it. There was this Pharaoh's highest ranking official. He kept Simeon. Now at this point, my dad is ticked. They realize their money's back in the sack. They get home, and they tell Dad this story, and Jacob says this. He says, you've already lost me, Joseph, and now I don't have Simeon, and now you want me to entrust Benjamin to you? There's no way I'm giving Benjamin back. There is no way. Every time I send you guys away, things get worse. I'm not doing it. You guys, honestly, when I think about my father's faith, it makes me sad. My father's faith was so far from being full. Every time there was trials in his life, he thought the world was against him. And in this moment, he missed that God was doing something. And you know what's amazing to me, as I've heard the story told back to me, because I wasn't there, was that Judah was the one that stepped up. Judah steps up to Dad and says this, hey, look, I know that I bailed on you at one point, but Dad, I'm going to stand up for him. I'm not going to let Benjamin be taken. I give you my word, I give you my life. But here's the reality, Dad. We're dying here because we don't have food. So I'm going, and I'm taking Benjamin with me. Now, have you ever stood up to your dad like that or not? But Dad listened. Dad said, okay. Dad gathered all the best spices, all the gifts, all the fruits, pistachios. Are those good or what? Yeah, there's all this stuff, and he sends them with my brothers, and the brothers go as fast as they can. Double the money from the first round that they stole from me. Man, it was so fun messing with them. And they come back, and they get in there. Now, they are terrified when they come to see me the second time. They know how powerful I am. They know that they've stolen from me. They don't know how. They just know that they have. And they come in, and I had my servant meet them at the front. I was actually out and about doing other stuff. But I had my servant meet them to try to give them some ease, to say that it was going to be okay. And they said, you don't understand. We didn't mean to take anything. We didn't mean to steal, but we did, so we brought double, and we brought extra goods right now, and we have all this stuff for you. So they said, well, come on over. Let's go to the house of the right-hand man. Let's go to my house. And it was pretty fun as they get there. I remember watching down and peering in on them, and I realized something. They had kind of set up a display case of all their gifts. They had like a pistachio nut corner, and they made it look all nice. They used like floating and all this kind of stuff, and it looked beautiful. And I'm watching this take place. They don't have any idea that I'm watching. I'm watching this take place, and really what I'm looking for is Benjamin here, because I love Benny. I didn't get to spend enough time with him as my little brother. I love him, and I want to see if he's all right. And I remember walking down the stairs. I kind of had stairs like this, and I walked down to go see them. Now, the irony for me in all of this is that they don't remember this, but all these balms and spices and potpourri, I hate those smells. So I'm walking past these smells that remind me of their hatred and their sinning against me. They think they're trying to set me up and them up for success. Here's the reality. They're actually ticking me off. But I walk right past their amazing display cases because I see Benjamin and I say, is that your younger brother? And they said, yes. And I took off and I went away because I was so overwhelmed with emotion I was weeping. You don't know what it's like to be in pain and suffering for so long and then get that relief. So I come back and I wash my face and I say, guys, we got to eat. It's time to eat. So we threw a huge banquet. I set up my own banqueting table and all the brothers there, and I had my servants align them in order of age. It was just so much fun to mess with these guys. They're like, how does he know? Well, I'm their brother. So I have them sit in the order of age, and I give Benjamin the most food possible. Pile it high. Now, everyone had tons of food. And we get done eating the meal, and I say, thank you for coming. Simeon is released. Load up their sacks and send them home. But what I told my servant was, take my silver chalice and put it in Benjamin's bag. My cup. My most sacred, special cup. I said, take that, put it in Benjamin's bag. And he did so. And as they took off, and as they went away, I sent my steward, my servant, after them. I said, go catch them and tell them that they've stolen the cup from me. So they do, and they get all the way up to him. And they stop the brothers, all 11 of them at this point, and they say, how dare you do this to my master? He's loved you. He's cared for you. He's given you food. How would you, you've taken his money. How would you take his special cup? And I know you might think I'm like a 3-year-old, right? My sippy cup. But I am. And they say, they respond with all this confidence because they know they've not taken it. They say, look, here's the reality. If anyone has taken this cup, we'll be his slave. If any one of these people has done that, we will be your slave forever. So they go through the bags, and Benjamin opens his bag, and he pulls out the cup, and you can imagine all the brothers. C-R-A-P. That's what they thought. They got brought back home to my house. They come back to my house, and they all stand in front of me, and I say, how dare you? How dare you do this? I've cared for you. I've loved you. I've given you food. I've returned your money. I've given you banquet. I've given you food like no one has ever had in this land, and you treat me this way. How dare you do this? And it was fun as I said, hey, you know what? You 10 brothers, you go back home. You didn't do anything wrong. Just Benjamin. Benjamin, you stay. Jacob remembered what he told Dad. Judah remembered, and he said this, no. Please take me. Judah begged me. Judah said, please do not take Benjamin. You don't understand what this would do to my dad. And here's the reality. I'm like, yeah, I do. Judah did for Benjamin what he never did for me. Judah begged me. He said, take my life. I'll be your servant forever. I will give you everything. And Judah stepped up. You remember who Judah is. He is I can't even tell you in a holy way what he is. Something had changed in his life. He took responsibility. He owned his sin. He changed. He said, I can't have this happen. And it was at that moment that I saw this was the whole purpose of the silver cup. This was the whole purpose of putting money back in the bag. This was the whole purpose of keeping Simeon, was so that my brothers would understand that God was for them and worthy to be praised and worshiped, that they would not live for themselves, but that they would live for him. And it was in that moment I saw that from Judah. From Judah, the man that slept with Canaanite women, the man that disrespected my father, the man that sold me into slavery. And I saw that from Judah, and I started to bawl. You know those tears when like you make noises that shouldn't come from human bodies? I mean, I cried so loud that I left, and the Pharaoh's people heard. We're talking about embarrassment in front of your boss. Snot flying everywhere. And I go and I wash my face, because that's what I do when I get freaked out. I just go and I wash my face. And I get composed. And I come back in, and I see my brother standing here, and it's that moment that I say, I'm Joseph. You could hear a pin drop in the room. They looked at each other and said, what? I said, guys, I'm Joseph. I'm the one that you sold into slavery over 20 years ago. I'm he. And you know what they said? I'm so sorry. And Judah was the one that led the way. Judah was the one that stepped out and said, Joseph, forgive me. And they were like, my gosh, we've ruined God's plan. We've messed everything up. But I said, guys, no, you don't understand. God sent me before you. If God doesn't allow you to sell me into slavery, then I never end up in Potiphar's house. And if I never end up in Potiphar's house, then I actually don't end up in Pharaoh's house. And if I don't end up in Pharaoh's house, do you understand that we would all be dead because we don't have food? And I got to tell my brothers that. I got to tell my brothers that in the midst of their life, when they feel like all the pieces are falling apart, that God is actually putting all the pieces in the exact place that he wants them. What they intended for evil, but God used for good. Amen? Drew said you were kind of Baptist-costal, so I'm glad you were with me. It was in that moment I think my brothers understood what I wanted for them was not their sorry, I wanted their love for God. And they finally got it. That's all that God wanted for them, was their trust. And you'll have to forgive me because I just get so dang excited when I tell this story. I get distracted on time sometimes, and I lose track of details. It's all in my biography, Genesis 37 to 50. I'd encourage you to go read it. It's an incredible story of trust, but really I want you to get 4 things out. And Drew told me that no matter what, I'd go quicker than he did, so I figure we've got a little more time. But there's really 4 things I don't want you to miss from my story. 4 things that if you miss, then it was in vain. Here's the first one. God is the one writing your story, and it's for his glory. I think that we have a temptation in life, whether we're sitting in prison, we're sitting in the cancer ward, we're sitting at surgery, we're sitting in the principal's office, literally or metaphorically, to think, what the heck is going on? We must believe that God's the author. I saw that in my life in so many different ways. I saw the fact that even when I resisted temptation, it wasn't about the physical temptation, it was about the spiritual. Life was about God. Even when life was going well, it wasn't about the, oh man, I'm doing well. It was about God decided to make me prosper. I actually had never interpreted dreams apart from God in my life. Ever. But when God speaks, you listen. God's doing a work in you and through you. So God did a work through Potiphar in my life. God did a work through his wife. God did a work through Pharaoh, through the butler, through the baker. God was writing a story. And I had the privilege of self-discovery, of walking with God and saying, God, what do you have for me next? I think when God writes our stories, it often includes gifts. God gave me gifts in the same way that God gives you gifts. But they're not about you. They're about his story. Are you using the gifts that God has given you to further his story? Because I'll tell you, when I lived that way, it was amazing. I was actually nothing but a steward of the gifts of God. That's all I was. I started to realize that my time, my treasure, my talent, my relationships, any community gathering that was going on was about his glory. It was like I started to realize that parties were never just about parties, they were always about the gospel. You guys should do that. You guys should throw parties for the gospel. You guys should intentionally invest in relationships for the gospel, for the story of God to advance, and steward what he's given you well, because he gave it to you not just for your good, but for his glory. I realize that all of life is about spiritual leadership. Now, no disrespect to Drew and the pastors here, but they have no idea what kind of influence I had outside of the church and outside of the synagogue. See, I think that we fall into a trap often as the Israelites or as the New Testament church, where we think that spiritual work happens in spiritual environments, and we miss the reality that you and I are all called to spiritual work. We might call it secular work. We might say we're hanging out with Pharaoh, but you realize that every time I was with Pharaoh, who was really the one working? God. That my job with my gifts that he gave me were actually about God. They weren't about me. They weren't about profit, they were about glory. That's what mattered most. They're about understanding who he is. So every time that God revealed something to me or showed something to me, it was so that he might be magnified and glorified. And brothers and sisters, I think it's time that we start to understand that our job is only and exclusively to do the work of God. I don't care who signs your paychecks. It's about God. Can I get an amen for that? Don't fall into the trap that Blue Shield, now I don't know about Blue Shield, but someone told me Blue Shield exists nowadays. Or that your plumbing company or that your school are not about God. That is spiritual work, guys. Spiritual work is for the spiritual people. Who are they? I'm looking at them. You. Don't fall into the trap that pastors do spiritual work. You do spiritual work. We celebrate God's work in us and through us. The second thing I really want to encourage you with this morning is simply this. God's writing your story, and your story includes failures. Have you seen that so far in Genesis? Have you seen that in my biography? The failures are everywhere. The failures actually start with mine. As a young child, I thought that I was gifted for my own glory, and I missed it, and I rubbed it in my brother's face. It wasn't until I was in prison that I learned that I was put in authority to serve people. So maybe you're a manager today. Maybe you manage a household. Maybe you manage a school. Maybe you manage a facility. Maybe you manage your time and your treasure and your talent. Those are all for the purpose of God's glory. I missed that. That was one of my failures. There's not a ton of my failures recorded in Scripture. Trust me, they're there. You even saw some of them this morning. Did I tell you that I'm handsome? But my failures were actually being used by God. The other failure I saw was my father. You know, every time I talk about dad, it's in like a don't do this kind of a context. Every time. My dad approached all of opportunities for faith with fear. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? The world's falling apart. My sons are gone. This. There was no faith in my dad, which made no sense to me because his grandpa was Abraham. His grandpa was the guy that laid his dad Isaac on the altar. You think that this boy would have faith? He didn't. Over and over and over again, he failed in his faith journey. And if he can fail, so too can you and me. Let's not miss that. Let's not look at every tragedy as a tragedy and rather understand that God's the author of that too. And the good news is it gave me an opportunity to realize a couple things. We cannot mess up God's plan, even though Jacob could have and should have, it looked like. We can't. God was using Jacob. The bad news, of course, is that God's purposes will be fulfilled and we will be punished if we get in the way. Everything that Jacob held on tightly to, myself included, he lost. May that be a warning for us. Let's not hold on tightly to things that we don't need or care about. You might even leave your cars unlocked at night. Who knows? You start to recognize that none of this rubbish matters. It's just rubbish. That was Jacob. And I learned from my dad, and the good news was it highlighted the contrast between a good father and my father. Maybe you guys have a bad relationship with dads. When we talk about God as the Father, you're like, I don't want that. Understand that there's a good Father that loves us, that cares for us as we are, where we are, that he knows the crud that we're going through, that he has allowed it, but he hasn't abandoned us, that he's with us, that he's for you. Then I look at the failure of my brothers. They tried to kill me, but I look at Judah specifically. The difference between confession and repentance. The first time I saw Judah again, that first trip to the palace, it's like they knew they were wrong. Reuben said it. It's like the brothers knew, man, what we've done is wrong. But anyone can confess what they've done is wrong. Like with Manasseh, it's so funny. When he tells me he's sorry, I'm like, no, you're not. You're only sorry because you got caught. But repentance is different. Repentance is when I get the opportunity, I'll choose something different. That's what repentance is. And Judah repented that moment that he said, no, take Benjamin instead of me. Judah repented that moment. See, God had a divine calling on Judah's life. God was using all of his sin. God even used his sin with the Canaanites to separate us for 400 years, to purify us so that we might be the line to lead to Jesus. That's how God used Judah. And if God can use an idiot like my big brother, I think he can use you too. Because you can't be as bad as Judah, but it's not about Judah, it's about God. God's grace to him, God's grace to my father, God's grace to me. God uses failures to move his mission forward. They're not like he takes some bad situation and says, how can I make this good? No, God allowed that to happen. He's powerful enough to use our failures and our mistakes to move his mission forward, which kind of leads to my third encouragement for you guys this morning is don't misunderstand that sometimes the failures aren't yours. We live in a messed up world. There's natural tragedies. There's hurricanes. There's all sorts of things that happen in this world. And when failures of this world happen, that doesn't mean that God's not on his throne still being king. We might not know what he's doing, but he is. And it's imperative that we understand this, that sometimes our failures aren't ours, like my dad's failure to me, my brother's failure to me. But that doesn't mean that God's not using them. I want you to think about all the injustice just in my life. Because I think we live in this world where we can get into pity parties. You think I ever had a pity party moment? I did. You don't know about it, but I did. And I had to remind myself that I was obedient, but I was hated, and brothers are going to hate. I had to remind myself that I was honorable with this woman, but I was slandered in spite of that. I was used of God with the butler, but I was forgotten. But I was never forgotten by God. Ever. God was using all those things for my purposes. In fact, Paul quotes me in Romans 8:28. No one knows this. I'm just telling you this today. Paul quotes me because I was the one that sat in prison. I said, but I know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, to those who are called according to his purpose. Here's the question. You don't know what his purpose is for your life. So don't look at a story in the middle of it. Trust the God that authored it all. The last thing is simply this. The presence of God changes everything. I sat in prison. God was with me. I sat in that dungeon. I sat in that pit of dry land. God was with me. I sat in Pharaoh's house. God was with me. Everywhere I went, God was with me. And he's with you too this morning. You can't escape his presence. My brothers, they couldn't escape it. Every time I walked, every time I stepped, God was with me and God was for me. Guys, that changes everything. I don't know what you're facing today. No idea. I'm not even from your town. But I know that my God is good. I know that when I sit in his presence, that I start to see things from his perspective, and I understand that nothing can separate me from the love of God. No height nor depth, nor neither created thing. No marriage issue, no child issue, no cancer diagnosis, no boss problem. I had boss problems. None of that can separate you from his presence. None of it. See, I used to spend some time in my low moments thinking about how I could change circumstances. You know what I learned in those moments? God wanted my circumstances, and if he didn't, he would have had them be different. So instead of trying to get out of my circumstance, I started to see God in them. Write that down, church. Instead of trying to get out of my circumstances, I started to look for God in them. And what I found was his presence everywhere. In his presence, there is grace. In his presence, there is forgiveness. So when I see my brothers, I'm able to forgive. In his presence, there is love that allows me to love the unlovable. In his presence, there is purpose. A purpose to famine, a purpose to angst, a purpose to failure, because his presence uses it. In his presence, he is holy. In his presence, he is love. In his presence, he loves you who are unlovable. But he sees you as he sees me. an adopted, chosen son. And he loves us. Don't look for the ways out of your circumstances. Let me encourage you this morning, embrace them. I don't know what you're going through, but he does. He knows that you want to move. He knows that you want to leave. He knows that you want to be done. He knows that you want to quit. He knows you want to throw in the towel. Don't do it, church. Instead, open your hands. Bow your heads in your heart and just say, God, I want to sit in your presence. God, I want to receive what you have for me. I want to hear your voice. I want to experience your love. I want to know that nothing can separate me from you, and that you are good, and that your love endures. May we receive that this morning.